2.5 million computers. That number is worth sitting with for a moment. Not 2.5 million users switching their personal preference, not a small government department experimenting with alternatives, 2.5 million workstations, the machines that French civil servants use every day to run the infrastructure of one of the largest economies in Europe. And France has announced a plan to move all of them away from Windows. The question that should immediately occur to anyone paying attention is not which operating system replaces it. The question is why. Why would a major democratic government, a country with the resources to pay whatever Microsoft charges, a country with decades of institutional investment in Windows infrastructure, voluntarily take on the staggering complexity of replacing that infrastructure at this scale? The answer is not about software preferences. It is not about cost savings, though cost plays a role. It is about something that governments have only recently begun to articulate clearly, and that, once articulated, changes the entire conversation about who controls the technology that runs modern states. Stay with this, because what France decided in April 2026 is not a technology story. It is a sovereignty story, and it is one that the rest of the world is watching more carefully than Microsoft would prefer. In April 2026, France announced that its government ministries had been directed to develop migration plans for replacing Microsoft Windows across approximately 2.5 million civil servant workstations with Linux-based alternatives. The announcement was part of a broader digital sovereignty initiative that also included replacing Microsoft Teams and other foreign collaboration platforms with domestically developed alternatives. It is essential to be precise about what this announcement represents and what it does not. France did not convert 2.5 million computers overnight. The announcement established a direction and a planning requirement. Ministries were instructed to develop migration roadmaps, not to complete migrations immediately. The actual transition will unfold over years, will face significant practical obstacles, and may well encounter the kind of organizational and political resistance that has derailed similar efforts before. But the announcement itself is the story, not because of what has already happened, but because of what it represents for a government of this size and significance to make this decision at all. France is not a country known for impulsive technology decisions. Its government technology infrastructure is substantial, deeply integrated, and expensive to operate. The people who made this announcement understood the complexity of what they were proposing. They made the announcement anyway. That decision demands an explanation. The word that appears in every French government statement about this initiative is souveraineté numérique, digital sovereignty. It sounds like a political abstraction. It is, in practice, a very specific and very concrete concern. Consider what it means for a government to run its operations on software it does not control. Every Windows installation on a French government workstation runs code written by a company headquartered in Redmond, Washington. The licensing terms are set by that company. The update schedule is set by that company. The decision about when a version of Windows reaches end of life, and therefore when the government must either pay for extended support or upgrade to new hardware, is made by that company. The cloud infrastructure that increasingly powers Windows features is operated by that company in data centers subject to American law, including American legal authorities' ability to compel access to data stored there. For an ordinary business, these dependencies are acceptable trade-offs for the convenience and capability that Microsoft's ecosystem provides. For a government responsible for the personal data of millions of citizens, for the operational continuity of national infrastructure, for the security of sensitive communications and state records, the calculus is different. When France updates its nuclear energy policy, manages its tax collection system, or coordinates its national defense, it does so using software that is updated on a schedule it did not set, governed by a licensing agreement it cannot fundamentally alter, and increasingly integrated with cloud services that operate outside French legal jurisdiction. That is the sovereignty problem. And it is the reason this story is about much more than a preference for open source software. Given the sovereignty framing, Linux's appeal to a government in France's position becomes immediately legible. Linux is open source. The source code, every line of instruction that makes the operating system function, is publicly available for inspection. A government that deploys Linux on its workstations can, in principle, read every instruction the operating system executes. It can verify that the operating system does what it says it does. It can identify and modify behavior that it finds unacceptable. It is not dependent on a vendor's assurance that the software behaves correctly. It can verify the claim independently. Licensing is the second dimension. Linux carries no per-seat licensing fee to a foreign corporation. The French government can deploy Linux on every workstation it operates without writing a check to an American company for the privilege. The money that would have gone to Microsoft licensing can be redirected toward French software development, toward IT training for government employees, toward the infrastructure that makes the transition possible. Long-term control is the third dimension. When Microsoft decides that Windows 10 has reached end of life, France must respond. pay for extended support, upgrade hardware, or accept security risk. When the Linux community develops the next version of the kernel, France can choose to adopt it, modify it, or maintain its own version on its own schedule. The decision belongs to France rather than to a company whose primary obligation is to its shareholders. These arguments are real, and they are compelling. They explain why Linux is attractive to any organization that values control over its own technology infrastructure. But here is what those arguments do not address, and this is where the story gets significantly more complicated. Installing Linux on 2.5 million computers is the easy part of this transition. It is technically straightforward, relatively inexpensive, and can be accomplished with planning and time. Replacing the ecosystem those computers operate within is a different challenge entirely. French government employees use applications, specialized software for tax administration, for legal document management, for procurement systems, for interministry communication, that were written for Windows. Some of them were written specifically for Windows. Some of them are old enough that the companies that originally developed them no longer exist, and the source code that would allow them to be rewritten for a different platform is not available. Document compatibility is a second obstacle. The French government exchanges documents with citizens, with European institutions, with international partners, and with contractors who all use Microsoft Office. The open document format, the file format that LibreOffice and other open source Office suites use natively, is not universally supported by the organizations France interacts with. Managing the conversion of decades of documents stored in Microsoft formats while maintaining ongoing compatibility with external partners who have not made the same migration is a logistical undertaking of considerable scale. Employee training is the third obstacle, and arguably the most underestimated one. A civil servant who has used Windows and Microsoft Office for 15 years does not simply switch to a Linux desktop and continue working at the same productivity level. The learning curve is real, the resistance to change is human and predictable, and the productivity cost of large-scale retraining across a workforce of millions is not negligible. History provides a warning that the French planners must have examined carefully. Munich, Germany, launched a Linux migration initiative called Linux in 2003 that was, by every technical measure, successful. Linux was installed, applications were migrated, the infrastructure worked, and then, in 2017, Munich reversed the decision and began migrating back to Windows. The reasons given were not technical. They were organizational. Employee complaints about usability, political pressure from business partners who preferred Microsoft compatibility, and a change in political leadership that reframed the priorities of the initiative. The Munich experience is the most important historical data point for evaluating France's ambitions. It demonstrates that Linux migrations in government settings can fail, not because Linux is technically inadequate, but because replacing an ecosystem requires sustained organizational will across political cycles that do not always cooperate. France is not Munich. The scale is different, the political framing is different, and the digital sovereignty argument provides a strategic rationale that was less clearly articulated in Munich's case. But the organizational challenge is real regardless of the political framing, and acknowledging it honestly is necessary for understanding what France is actually attempting. The title of this documentary describes Microsoft as having no answer to France's move. That framing deserves precision. Microsoft has answers, commercial answers, partnership offers, cloud service alternatives, compliance frameworks designed to address data sovereignty concerns. Large technology companies facing government pushback have extensive playbooks for navigating these situations. What Microsoft does not have a clean answer to is the fundamental strategic argument France is making. If the French government's position is that its dependence on foreign technology infrastructure is a sovereignty risk, not a commercial inconvenience, but a strategic vulnerability, then no licensing discount or data center location offer fully addresses the concern. The concern is structural, not contractual. The financial stakes of this particular migration are not the primary issue for Microsoft. France represents a meaningful enterprise customer, but losing the French government's Windows licenses would not materially damage Microsoft's revenues. What France represents strategically is a different matter. When a government of France's size and credibility frames an operating system as a national sovereignty issue, it does something that no amount of marketing can easily counteract. It legitimizes the conversation for every other government watching. The question that other governments' technology ministries are now being asked, in internal meetings, in parliamentary committees, in procurement reviews, is a version of the same question France asked itself. Are we comfortable with the degree of dependence our government operations have on technology infrastructure we do not control? That question, once asked seriously, is difficult to dismiss with a better licensing deal. France's announcement did not emerge in isolation. It arrived in a European context that has been moving in this direction for several years. Germany has been pursuing its own digital sovereignty agenda, with the state of Schleswig-Holstein announcing migration plans toward Linux and open source software in government operations. The German federal government has invested in developing sovereign tech fund initiatives supporting open source infrastructure. The European Commission has established policies favoring open standards and interoperability in public procurement. The European Union's broader regulatory posture toward American technology companies through the General Data Protection Regulation, the Digital Markets Act, the Data Act, and ongoing investigations into cloud service providers reflects a continental concern about technology dependence that France's Linux migration plan represents in its most concrete operational form. This is not a unified European march toward Linux. Different countries are at different stages of this conversation, and the practical barriers are as real in Berlin and Brussels as they are in Paris. Germany's own Linux migration history includes more false starts than successes at the government level. But the directional conversation has shifted. Where digital sovereignty was once the language of technology advocates and academic researchers, it is now the language of government ministers and parliamentary committees. The operating system on a civil servant's workstation has become part of a political conversation about national infrastructure and strategic autonomy. That shift in framing is itself significant, regardless of how many computers are actually converted. Return to the number, 2.5 million workstations. The honest framing of France's announcement is not that Windows has been removed from those machines. It is that France has decided those machines should eventually run something else and has directed the responsible ministries to develop the plans to make that happen. The success or failure of this initiative will depend on factors that cannot be predicted with confidence today: the quality of the migration planning, the availability of adequate Linux-based alternatives for specialized government applications, the sustained political will to continue the project across the inevitable obstacles, and the lessons drawn from previous migration attempts both within France and in comparable governments elsewhere. What can be said with confidence is that the announcement itself represents a threshold that has been crossed in how governments think about technology infrastructure. The question France asked, do we control our own digital environment, or has that control been delegated to companies that are not accountable to our citizens, is a question that does not become less relevant after it has been asked. Microsoft's strategic challenge is not the loss of 2.5 million Windows licenses, painful as that would be commercially. Its strategic challenge is the spread of the question France asked. Because every government that asks the same question and arrives at the same answer represents a potential departure from the ecosystem that has been the foundation of enterprise computing for 3 decades. 2.5 million computers, a government decision, a word, sovereignty, that has become the organizing principle of a technology migration that will take years to complete, may encounter setbacks that force reconsideration, and will be watched by technology ministers in dozens of countries as a case study in whether this kind of transition is truly achievable. The most important thing France did in April 2026 was not install Linux on a single workstation. It was decide, at the level of national policy, that the operating system running on its civil servants' computers was no longer a pure technology question. It was a question of who makes the decisions, about updates, about access, about data, about the terms on which a government's own infrastructure operates. That mindset, once established at the government level, has a way of spreading. Not quickly, and not without friction, but persistently, because the underlying concern it addresses is not going away. And perhaps the most interesting question this story leaves behind is not whether France will succeed. It is how long it takes before the same question that France asked about its government computers, who actually controls this and is that acceptable, starts being asked by the businesses that run on Windows, by the institutions that depend on it, and eventually by the ordinary users who have simply never had a reason to ask it before. Because if a government can decide that its operating system is a matter of national sovereignty, the next question almost writes itself. What does that make it for the rest of us?